welcome to Decarbonize, the Clean Energy Podcast from Fresh Energy. Fresh Energy is a Minnesota nonprofit working to speed our state's transition to a clean energy economy. My name is Isaac Quam, and I'm the Director of Communications here at Fresh, and I'm also your host for today's episode. I'm excited to be joined by my colleagues Anjali Bains, our Managing Director of Transportation, and Nick Haeg, our Senior Associate of Electric Vehicles. Thanks for joining, Anjali and Nick. Are you both ready to talk about the true cost of oil?
Yes, let's dig in.
Yeah, very excited to talk about this.
All right. So oil is on a lot of people's minds these days. Gas prices have spiked this year, leaving Americans who are already affected by affordability stretched even more thin. We're in a global geopolitical conflict tied to oil, and 2026 is on track to be the hottest year in US history, a milestone that we seem to be breaking year after year, all thanks to greenhouse gas emissions from burning oil. Fresh Energy recognizes the need to transition from an oil-based economy, and the transportation sector accounts for 2/3 of our country's petroleum consumption. Shifting away from oil to clean electric solutions will take technology, new funding, and policy solutions. And in order to move beyond oil, we have to clearly understand the oil industry itself. Our reliance on oil has been shaped carefully and intentionally through policy decisions, federal and state subsidies, and public campaigns against electric vehicles, transit, and climate science. And all of it has come with a hefty price tag for people and our planet. We are going to be talking about the true cost of oil in today's podcast episode. And as we kind of kick off this very big, broad topic, I think, Anjali, before we start talking about subsidies and dollar figures, can you walk us through what oil actually is?
Yeah, thanks, Isaac. So I studied environmental engineering in college, so this really brought me back to our chemical processes classes and really looking at the composition of these fuels. So oil, or crude oil, as it's called when it's just coming off the ground, is a liquid hydrocarbon. It's just a fancy way of saying a mixture of hydrogen and carbon molecules that formed over millennia from prehistoric organisms called diatoms that fell to the ocean floor and had layers of rock and sand built up over them over time. In other words, it's a classic fossil fuel for that reason. And like other fossil fuels, oil needs to be extracted via drilling or mining and then refined and processed into the petroleum products we use every day, like gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and inputs for plastics and asphalt. Gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel are all transportation fuels that need to be combusted to provide power to the engines. And as a result, as you mentioned, greenhouse gases and other air pollutants like particulate matters are released when you combust these fuels. That is one major reason why the transportation sector is the #1 emitting sector of climate emissions in both Minnesota and the US. And then when you add in the extraction, refining, processing, and shipping climate impact of oil to refineries and then to fueling stations, that big climate footprint gets even bigger.
Be honest, whenever we're talking about oil, it always reminds me of the 2007 movie There Will Be Blood with Daniel Day-Lewis, about the oil prospector whose greed and obsession for it drives him away from his family and his community. I don't know. Have either of you seen that movie? I feel like I'm always thinking of that when we talk about oil.
Yeah, I would say that movie got me and my sister really into watching Oscar-winning films. So it has its own place in the Bains family film lore too.
That's awesome. Anjali, can you talk a little bit about how oil ties in to Minnesota?
Yeah, it was actually really interesting when I did some more research on this. I found out that Minnesota has the largest oil refinery for a state that doesn't actually have its own oil reserves. So we have two oil refineries here in the state located around the Twin Cities. And because we don't have our own oil reserves, as I mentioned, we refine oil that's piped in from North Dakota or from Canada. And, listeners might recall the big Line 3 fight that happened about 4 or 5 years ago, and that was over building a new pipeline to bring oil from Canada. The kind of extra thing to know about oil from Canada is while the average barrel of oil is pretty climate polluting already, as we've talked about, the Canadian oil we get is even worse since it comes from this viscous, thick form that actually is like embedded in the soil and dirt called tar sands. And because it's so mixed up in the sediment, it really needs much more water and energy to refine it into a usable petroleum product. As a result, tar sand oils has up to 30% more greenhouse gas emissions than conventional oil, along with other polluting elements.
Yes, I remember reading about tar sands oil in a book called Fire Weather by John Valiant. This is a book listeners who are also Fresh Energy blog readers might recognize it. I recommended it on our annual climate book recommendation post that we publish on the website. But this book, Fire Weather, kind of gave a big history about Canadian oil and talked a lot about the impurities of tar sands and how much energy is actually needed just to refine it to be a usable petroleum product, which is kind of it's certainly a lot to learn about. But as the industry continues to push growth and extraction, even after decades of us all knowing how destructive oil can be and how short-sighted it is compared to clean energy, Anjali, what can you tell me about the oil industry's knowledge of climate change over the past half century?
Yeah, I know. This is another part of the research that you and I were talking about, Isaac. It's always interesting to dig into the history of actually how long the oil industry and the automakers knew that climate change was possible from rising carbon emissions. And there's a great website called DSmog that does a really good job of investigating into really what's the knowledge that these companies had and also what are the continuing actions they're doing even today. So zooming back, I think many folks will have heard by now that oil companies and automakers knew about climate impacts for 50 years, more than 50 years. It was in the 60s that their scientists in-house started to do research and noticed, a trend between climate emissions and carbon emissions going up and global warming happening. Unfortunately, instead of deciding to invest in a new product that could help mitigate some of that, they decided to bury the research and ran a very long disinformation campaign to divert attention from regulations on those industry and to actually undercut the kind of investments that would be needed to switch their products into cleaner forms of energy like electric vehicles. So you then had decades of both attacks on electric vehicles and investments, and also attacks on public transit, which is an alternative to things like cars and would reduce overall our reliance on gasoline. The good news is that because this information is now out in the public, states like Minnesota are able to push to hold these oil companies accountable. So here in Minnesota, our Attorney General actually launched a lawsuit in 2020 against several big oil companies for these deceptive practices and fraudulent claims related to climate change. That case is still winding its way through courts, but it did overcome a legal challenge actually for dismissal this past April, and so it will be proceeding to the discovery phase. So I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot more about what exactly oil companies do and didn't act on in the coming year or so. In the meantime, unfortunately, these well-worn delay tactics continue, with many automakers recently successfully lobbying the Trump administration to repeal greenhouse gas emission standards for new passenger cars and trucks. I was also reading today on DSmog blog about how there's a current effort for the oil and gas industry to undercount the methane that comes from their processes in order to also make sure their climate impact is smaller than it could be.
As a climate communicator, I feel like a lot of my day-to-day job is confronting and pushing back against narratives that the oil and gas industry has kind of like worked for decades to influence public opinion, and then which eventually makes its way into our policies and political discussions as well. I'm gonna
Yeah, and maybe
yeah, go ahead.
I'll add in there, and when we're talking with these companies, we are a group that really thinks about just transition, also including the workers in the fossil fuel industries. So I just want to make clear for any listeners, we are not trying to demonize these oil and gas companies, but we do want to point out that the decision that those in leadership, especially in power of these companies, have been making for decades. The workers of these companies are really should deserve family sustaining jobs as well. And we're really excited what the clean energy economy can bring for everyone, even if those workers are currently in the fossil fuel industry.
Yes,
Great. Back to you, Isaac.
I was going to say there's like some really exciting developments there with advanced geothermal, enhanced geothermal for oil and gas
Sustainable
industry.
aviation fuel. Yeah.
Sustainable aviation fuel. We talked in the podcast recently. There's a lot of really exciting clean technologies that can work with these workers as well. If listeners, I'm going to plug another book. If listeners are curious about what Anjali have been talking about, I also reviewed a book called Merchants of Doubt on the Fresh Energy website. It's a great history about kind of how the oil and gas industry has used scientific issues and talking how they discuss things in public to kind of obscure the truth about climate change over decades. Very, very interesting read. But if we're going to be talking about accountability, we also have to talk about subsidies, because while the oil industry loves to talk about how clean energy receives a lot of subsidies, the truth is that the oil industry also itself receives lots of subsidies, often in, direct and indirect specific ways. Anjali, can you get into how those subsidies play out?
Yeah, definitely. I'm glad we're talking about this because it is often through no, fault of anyone's own that one of the biggest questions we get from the general public is, well, if electric vehicles are starting to take off, like why do they need more subsidies? And same with solar and wind or any other clean energy technology. And it is true in one sense that subsidies and incentives can really help nascent technologies compete against incumbent market leaders, such as fossil fuel-based technology. But the other side of it is recognizing that actually these industries have been subsidized for much longer. And one of the reasons they have such a strong grip on our fuel market is through these subsidies. The oil and gas industry is actually one of the most heavily subsidized industries in American history and has been for over a century. U.S. fossil fuel companies received 29.4 billion in direct subsidies every year, and that means direct subsidies. So actual, tax cuts or other payments that help them keep doing their fossil fuel business at a lower cost. And this is mostly through tax laws written more than 100 years ago that let companies underreport their profits and overstate their expenses. So as I mentioned, this is really making it easier to sell fossil fuels like gasoline and diesel at a cheaper price than it should be. So you have things like cheaper land leases on federal property that were really underpriced so that they're a steal for these oil companies to use and drill and extract on, or even more specific aspects like bonus depreciation for how they can track their expenses, which essentially means that they end up paying less taxes to the US taxpayers. So as I mentioned, these subsidies have been ongoing. And so while wind and solar have lost most of their direct subsidies, especially in the last couple of years, these subsidies are permanent and codified often in our laws, and sometimes even expanded. A recent example can be found in the One Big Beautiful Bill that passed last year, which cut incentives for clean energy, including electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging, and alternative clean fuels like sustainable aviation fuel. We mentioned it went from $1.75 per gallon incentive down to $1 per gallon. But it also boosted subsidies for fossil fuels, which was less covered at that time. So because it was such a quiet move, it's a move that one organization who analyzed the bill called the largest single year increase in subsidies for the oil and gas industry we've seen in many years. So again, this is something that's ongoing, it's persistent, and it's built in the fabric of how we pass policies and incentives here in the US.
I
And
think
oh,
go ahead.
go for it.
I was going to say, I think one thing that folks that work in the energy industry know that the general public might not know is that the oil industry has really written a lot of the rules of the game so that their energy source is favored every step of the way. And they like to kind of focus on the ways that clean energy isn't delivering or it's getting certain subsidies. But the truth is that they've kind of stacked the deck in their own favor.
Yes, yeah. And a lot of these subsidies are going to the companies and therefore going to the company profits, not necessarily lowering bills for transportation costs for Americans.
Which is very important given recent affordability issues Minnesotans and Americans have been facing in recent years. I also want to talk about negative externalities. So negative externalities is a term encompassing the costs that aren't included in the price that we actually pay. And Nick, you've written a lot about how climate and public health costs from burning oil far outweigh the subsidies that we provide them. What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, this is, I think, a really important topic. So, like Anjali was saying, these fossil fuel companies have been getting a ton of money from governments in incentivizing them to drill, baby, drill and expand the resources and earning them a lot of profits. The good news is globally, that is starting to wane a little bit. We're starting to see governments pull away from these, maybe not in the US as much, but globally, governments are starting to get an eye on these things, and the overall direct subsidy that fossil fuel companies are getting is decreasing. That number is still, according to the International Monetary Fund, $725 billion in direct subsidy. So that's not talking about the negative externalities yet. When you put in those indirect subsidies, these implicit subsidies, the ways that we're not taxing the harm that these oil and gas companies are causing on our climate and public health, that figure is $6.5 trillion annually. That's 6% of global GDP. That's an incredible amount of money that is just gone out the door. For every $100, $6 is just burned up, subsidizing, not taxing the harm that is caused to people from oil and gas. So a big chunk of that, 39%, is from the public health impacts. So that's all of the healthcare costs that go into people with asthma, people who are harmed, who get sick because of the pollution that is caused by burning fossil fuels. And then another 32% is climate change impacts. So as we know, that number is only going to get bigger as time goes on, as the extreme weather events get worse, as droughts and floods and hurricanes keep destroying our infrastructure and causing famine and many other harmful things. So those costs are going to get higher, but then also the implicit subsidies are getting worse. We're seeing that the global south, places where there is a lot of increasing fossil fuel usage, and we're expecting to see a lot of fossil fuel increase in the coming years, those places are increasing their implicit subsidies. And so we're going to see a lot of harm to our public health and climate because of the way that we are not accounting for the true costs of oil.
And I think a lot of people, the actual cost that we do pay, say at the pump for gasoline, but there's lots of oil products, but I think a lot of folks have seen that go up. So and over the past year, I think I saw an article in NPR News this morning that gas prices are again rising. Currently, the Minnesota average is $4.14 for a gallon of gas. Minnesotans, I think, really have it front of mind how this is costing them directly. And also thinking maybe these subsidies are warranted, though. Maybe helping keep those costs down at the pump is a good use of subsidies, but that's certainly not the full picture. How can we ensure that taking away fossil fuel subsidies won't negatively affect affordability for Minnesotans and Americans?
It's definitely true that if you took away all of these $6.5 trillion in indirect subsidies, untaxed costs to society, and you started making companies pay that, the costs that we would pay for gasoline would dramatically rise in ways that could hurt people in the short term, people who can't afford to go buy an electric vehicle right now, the costs of groceries and everything else will go up, just like we've been seeing in the wake of conflict in the Middle East recently. But we do have policy tools that can help mitigate or even eliminate this, while aligning consumer incentives towards decarbonization in ways that just letting these companies pollute scot-free does not align. It keeps the costs of oil artificially low and keeps people, addicted to oil in the long run because they're not facing the true costs of those things. And also, when we do things like what we're doing now, where, we've seen states eliminating the gas tax as like a temporary measure to help keep gasoline affordable for folks. And so, very reasonable thing. People are facing pain at the pump. You eliminate a 10-cent gas tax and a 20-cent gas tax, and it keeps things a little bit more manageable in the short run. But the people who really benefit from that the most are the people who earn the most, the people who consume the most. Think about people who own private jets getting this huge subsidy to keep flying their private jets, and eliminate the gas tax, they keep getting to do that. They get a lot more benefit from this temporary relief than folks who take the bus to work or who bike to work or who don't drive that much. So this is a real, as a policy tool, we have better policy tools to try and keep things affordable for folks and actually get the help to the people who really need it, rather than allowing people and companies to keep polluting more affordably. So removing these subsidies and actually taxing or charging polluters for the harm they cause to our climate and public health would generate revenue, which we could then reinvest into our communities and our clean energy economy and make everybody better off. I think that's, at Fresh Energy, the goal that we're really striving for.
Absolutely.
I
So we've
might add it in
Oh,
there.
go ahead.
Sorry, because Nick, you mentioned gas tax, and we've been talking a lot about the gas tax here in Minnesota. And as you point out, it can be politically expedient to want to suspend the gas tax, but it has real consequences for roadway funding. And we've seen in places like Minnesota and other states that when there's pressure on filling in the coffers that go towards our transportation infrastructure, the technologies that are getting penalized are electric vehicles. So it's all related. It's very interesting and all very complicated, but it is related. These actions on one hand affect then electric vehicles and affordability and adoption on the other hand.
It is interesting. The more you learn about these issues, the more you see how it crosses over into how connected so many different things are in terms of, between sectors that we need to address in climate, but then just, yes, we've talked about this in past podcasts as well.
Yeah, you'll definitely see, any state that has done a temporary gas tax relief, you best believe they're not doing an electric vehicle surcharge relief at the same time. So it's, as a policy tool, it really is just another way that we are not failing to incentivize decarbonization. And luckily, Minnesota has not pursued this strategy. But even places like Illinois, like Georgia, Illinois, Indiana, have suspended their gas tax or suspended increases to their gas tax because of the cost of oil. So, yeah.
So we've talked so far about how we subsidize the oil industry, and we've talked about how we underprice its pollution to climate and to public health. What other costs of oil are we missing that we haven't talked about yet?
Yeah, so I think maybe the elephant in the room is this war in Iran that I think has caused a massive impact to oil prices. The cost of military actions in general are causing a lot of are both those that are caused by oil or caused by the incentive to gain access to oil, and also the impacts that it has on our taxes, that the cost of these military operations, and then ultimately the cost that it has on our pocketbooks as we see the cost of oil rise as a result of the military actions. So I think these all things combined, we see examples very recently. Operation Southern Spear in Venezuela cost $600 million and was pretty explicitly tied by President Trump to oil extraction and our desire to gain access to that oil there in Venezuela. The war in Iran has cost $37.5 billion as of late July, and that's just in the defense budget, let alone what it's cost to Americans in terms of increased gas prices and increased costs of food and increased costs of fertilizer and everything else that has gone into that through the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And not to mention, as a climate advocate, war pollutes too, and all of our climate models do not account for the costs of the carbon emissions of war. In the first 2 weeks of the Iran war released more carbon emissions than 84 countries do annually. So this is an immense amount of CO2 and other pollutants that are totally avoidable if we had not pursued this military action. The costs at the pump are obviously palpable. Diesel is up 51% from pre-war levels. That's $350 more a day to run a planter. Fertilizer costs are up 27%. All of that's going into our grocery bills in the long run. Gas prices, this has been called the most significant oil shock in history. It's up 52% since February, before the war began. We are still seeing, like Isaac said earlier, over $4 a gallon gasoline here in Minnesota. And as long as we have fossil fuel dependence, there's going to be this incentive to fight wars over it. This is going to cause this price shock cycle all over again. And not to mention, it's causing a lot of pain and suffering in the countries that are on the receiving end of those attacks. Fossil fuels also contribute to persistent problems in the world beyond just like the scope of these wars. Oil wealth helps solidify authoritarian regime control. You've got this situation where countries can go and use this money to solidify, to institute police states, to enact more harm on their citizenry. There's also situations that arise. There's this thing called Dutch disease. This is something that primarily happened in the 20th century, but you still see it today. It's also called a resource curse. This is a situation where, you know, you think, oh, we found some oil in our country, or we found some resource that we can export. This is going to be good. This is going to help everybody, right? But it can cause negative situations because of some economic phenomena, which I won't go into too much detail, but basically, if you export a lot, the cost of your currency goes up. And that means, it makes it harder for other industries to get off the ground because buying those things are now relatively more expensive. So if you have, for example, in the Netherlands, this is why it's called Dutch disease in the 1950s. They found a bunch of oil. They started exporting that oil. That was good in the short run, but it made it hard for other industries in the Netherlands to export, which, you know, maybe one of the reasons that the Netherlands doesn't have major car export companies like its neighbors like France and Germany, or it's one of the reasons that the Netherlands is, you know, the Netherlands obviously is doing fine now, but there are plenty of examples where this, like the discovery of oil, which you might think, hey, this is going to help our economy, it's going to be a boon to us, it actually ends up being a negative thing in the long run. That can be, or even in the short run, in the medium run, that can be because of authoritarian regimes taking advantage of it. That can be because private companies take advantage of it. That can be because it prevents diversification of the economy, or it hampers economic development in other sectors of the economy. So I think ultimately, all of these things have contributed to problems in both the United States and abroad, and we would be better off if we were able to move away from fossil fuels and move to this more diverse economy, this clean economy. And I think that's something we should strive for.
I haven't heard of Dutch disease before. You have more of an economics background than Anjali or I, Nick. Is this something you kind of learned about while you were studying economics?
Oh yeah. I think this is like something that comes up in Econ 111. If I think any listener out here who's taken an economics class, it probably rings a bell to them. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, Anjali and Nick, so we worked on this True Cost of Oil blog post way back in May when we were only a few months into the US war with Iran. What has changed since we wrote this piece back in May?
Yeah, I feel like Nick laid out some really good parts of it. And I think I don't know why I thought this might be over by now. I guess I have some optimism streak in my bones still. Um, but this is completely rewriting the geopolitical landscape around oil. And it's doing that because you have countries, like China and Europe who invested so much in electric vehicles. So there is this alternative it's just changing the landscape. I don't think we fully have seen the impact, but there is big changes afoot. And as Nick mentioned, oil prices have risen across the board, but different end users are feeling it differently. Like you mentioned, Nick, the impact in diesel has been much higher than the impact on consumer prices at the pump, gasoline, and the same thing with jet fuel. And that's partly because even though the US does have our own oil reserves and it is exporting oil, we don't refine every type of oil product. So we have a bigger capacity for certain oil products than others. But I just think that's a good reminder that certain industries are actually being hit harder by different parts of this this US war in Iran. And Isaac, last month we talked about sustainable aviation fuel, And that is something that is actually really impacted by what's currently happening with oil prices going up, because right now, sustainable aviation fuel does need to be blended into traditional fossil fuel-based jet fuel. So we're, looking on one hand, that sustainable aviation fuel, if it was 100% able to replace conventional jet fuel, that calculation is getting better. But in a technical sense, because you're required to blend it with conventional oil, that actually could hamper the development of SAF in the future, depending on how long this goes on. I think this all has reminded me how complicated an oil-dominated system is globally. That we're talking about global events that are impacting the entire world at this point in different markets, and it's hitting everyone in their pocketbooks, no matter where they are in the US. And I think that really highlights inherent vulnerabilities of continuing to rely on oil as our major source for transportation. And that can be sometimes hard to directly quantify that vulnerability. But I think the military costs that Nick laid out is a really good example of how you start to get a sense of the impact of keeping on this current system. Electricity, on the other hand, as we've talked about often, can be made locally from many sources, including from wind and solar. So I think the US war on Iran really highlights the difference in risk profile of relying on fossil fuels versus relying on zero emission fuels like electricity. But as Nick also said, fresh energy is trying to achieve a just and equitable clean energy transition. And there is no silver lining in this war in its potential to support a faster clean energy transition. It's so destructive and polluting, harmful to the people and environments. So it's really antithetical to everything we are pursuing in our work. So we really just think that this is not the right way to go about. We have to really focus on incentives, policy education to get the clean energy transition we need at the pace and scale we need.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Anjali just said. Like there's no silver lining. And it's kind of hard to talk about it without making it seem like there's a silver lining. But it is a horrible, horrible thing, loss of life, and like I said, the uh, harm both to people internationally and to Americans paying more is very real and avoidable. Um, and hopefully it's a lesson that we have the technology now to be more resilient in the face of these kinds of oil shocks. I think people are realizing that if the Strait of Hormuz can be closed at any moment, maybe they'd prefer to have a vehicle that is fueled by something that isn't subject to the consequences of that closure. We're seeing a rise in interest in electric vehicles, particularly internationally. I think 25% of new vehicle sales globally are now electric vehicles. So hopefully that trend continues and we can not worry so much in the long run about oil in general.
And you also, we talked a lot about oil here. Natural gas has also been impacted. It's another major export from that region of the US. So our friends in the buildings team are also probably tracking closely the impact on the natural gas sector and what it means for the building decarbonization work they're doing too.
Anjali, Nick, thank you both for breaking this down. Your cost is a lot higher than what shows up at the pump, and it's clear that Minnesotans are paying for it, whether they realize it or not. Do either of you have parting thoughts as we close out the podcast?
I think Nick said it best of the way we move forward is to really focus on the new technologies we have. And if we weren't paying the military costs associated with uh, what's happening in Venezuela, what's happening in Iran, that could be investments in this new future. So I think that is something that really I want to focus on, and we'll be working hard with partners across the board next legislative session to really hone the ability for electric vehicles to be an affordability solution.
For sure. I mean, we have the technology right now, and we have the policy tools to have abundant and affordable energy without spending trillions of dollars subsidizing fossil fuels. We have solar and wind, we have heat pumps, we have electric vehicles, we have batteries, we have electrolyzers to make green hydrogen from water. This isn't sci-fi stuff. This is stuff we have on hand right now. If we invest in these technologies, we can have all of the stuff that we like about having modern conveniences, medicine, refrigeration, and economic growth. These are things that I think, people would sometimes argue like fossil fuels have brought about for us. It's I think a more complicated picture than that, but I think in the 19th and 20th centuries, fossil fuels enabled a lot of this stuff. It enabled electrification. It enabled a lot of the modern conveniences that we enjoy today. And now we have the ability to have all of these things, but we can have them without imports through the Strait of Hormuz, without air pollution. And maybe most importantly, we can mitigate the worst impacts of climate change, which are only going to get even worse if we keep using fossil fuels. So I'm definitely excited to keep working on the transition, make it a just transition, make sure no one gets left behind, and look forward to a cleaner future. Yeah.
I think that's a perfect way to close out the episode. Anjali and Nick, thanks for being on the podcast.
Yeah. Thanks, Isaac.
Thank you.
Thank you for subscribing to Decarbonize, the clean energy podcast from Fresh Energy. You can stay up to date on Fresh Energy's work at fresh-energy.org or by following us on social media. Head to our website for the latest news from Fresh Energy and to read the corresponding blog post, The True Cost of Oil, as well as the climate book recommendations that I made during today's episode. You can also make a donation and register for upcoming events on our website. Thank you to the band Palm Psalm for providing our theme song, DGAF, off their album Otuhaka. Get the latest from the band at palmpsalm.com, and thank you for listening.